been in the pulpit, but it's good to be in this pulpit and with this, my church family. Hear this text read from John's Gospel, reading in the 6th chapter, as it opens, saying, "Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And the great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miracles and signs which he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on the hillside, sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was very near. When Jesus looked up, he saw a great crowd coming up to him. And he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread for these people?' He asked this to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a little. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. 'There is a boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?' Jesus said, 'Have the people sit down.' Now there was plenty of grass in the place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. And then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, 'Gather the pieces that are left over, that nothing be wasted.' And so they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over after all had eaten. And after all the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus said, they began to say, 'Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world.'" May the Lord bless to us the reading of his word. I have always loved this story. It's one of my favorites. Imagine with me, if you would, a humble house in this village near the Sea of Galilee. And a little boy comes running in saying, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, can I go today? There is a rabbi in the town and he has healed the sick and he's teaching. Can I go, Mommy? Can I go with them and see what's happening?" And, well, you know how it goes with one that size. And so she hastily draws together 5 barley loaves. They didn't have wheat bread, they had the barley loaves. And 2 dried fish, and wrapped them in a napkin and handed it to him and said, "Now you be back here before sundown." And he goes out the door and he begins to follow, and he comes down and realizes as he approaches that Jesus and the disciples have crossed a little inlet and are now going to an open space on the other side. The crowd, swollen because of the many people traveling for the holidays, give a sigh. The little boy said, I know how to get over there." And sure enough, he leads the crowd across, and they ford the stream and they come up, and there is Jesus and his disciples. Jesus turned to his disciple Philip and said, as he looked at this crowd growing, "Where are we going to get bread to feed all these people?" But he knew what he was going to do. Philip was the one you turn to in this kind of thing, because he, after all, was from this area and was a very good calculating man. Meanwhile, while that's going on, Andrew has received in his hand a little napkin wrapped around some food and turns around in some bewilderment to see what he is to do with this. Philip has already figured it out. he's saying, this looks like a monstrous crowd. And we don't have any money in the bank. I remember when Judas was talking the other night that we are short. And even if we had the money, it would take worlds of it, and walking over to Bethesda and coming back and feeding these is just not possible. It just can't be done. Andrew, meanwhile, however, is coming up with this little package. And he says, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. And he looks around, and Philip, who is the bank keeper, is just doing this, saying, you've got to be out of your tree. What are you saying? Look. And so he says, and what are they among so many? You know, these 2 men, followers of Jesus, if you were starting a business, you'd like to have Philip in your business because he was great at counting costs and making details come out right, and he was observant. He's the kind of guy that would have kept me from buying GE stock from my retirement fund. But he's no foolishness. He's there. So he works with his figures. I remember reading an article some while ago about a mathematician in New York City in the end of the 19th century who had predicted that the maximum population for this country would be 80 million people. He had figured that out by seeing how many horses are required to maintain a household and how much arid land do we have. And it's clear that we do not have arid land to raise hay for more than to support 80 million. And that's it. Settled. Of course, he didn't know some kid off in Detroit starting to buy cars. But anyway, that was it. That was all he had. Andrew, on the other hand, was a different kind of disciple. We constantly see Andrew standing on the outside of the crowd. He brings a Syrophoenician woman to him. He's responsible for Peter being in the group, even though poor Andrew is seldom ever introduced in the scriptures without saying he was Simon Peter's brother, like he didn't have any identity of his own. But he was there, and he was the one that could bring people in. Dr. Billy Graham used to say that he loved Andrew because he was a perfect church usher. He kept the crowd in coat and always brought people in to meet Jesus. And so Andrew is there, and he has brought this boy's lunch. And he's ready to make some kind of declaration, but as he does, he says, oh, what are they among so many? It wouldn't have been a wonderful statement of faith to say, Jesus, we know you can do anything. We've got something to start with. No, what are they among so many? And so he misses it. I've missed a lot of things that way. When things are really, really going well and you decide, well, it's not going to be so great after all. Maybe I don't have enough faith to reach across this gap here. But nonetheless, what happens? I recalled some time ago reading a German philosopher named Heinrich Philiker, who said, the most miserable people in the world are those who are half religious. That is, they know enough about their faith to know all of the things they can't do, but they don't know enough about their faith to rejoice in their religion. And they have the worst of both worlds. And I thought, yeah, just enough religion to be miserable. I'm not going to ask Robert to counter this, but I know the most difficult people to counsel with are the people who have been infected with religion but have never caught the disease. They complain about what's going on and whatever, but they can't step across that faith and say, okay, I'll believe. I'll be here. But meanwhile, let's go back to our hungry lad. Isn't it interesting? He gave away his lunch. He was as hungry as anybody in that crowd, but he got to eat too. It's not as if he was going to go home starved. He was going to eat too. He had no questions. He didn't know what was going to happen to his packaged lunch. He just thrust it into the hands of Andrew, and Andrew had carried it to Jesus. And there it was, right in the midst of everything. And he was happy with that. You know, Jesus talks about childlike faith, and also ought to talk to us about faith in child. You know, how we love children that can sometimes lead us out of the wilderness into the promised land. I remember years ago coming home, and when I had a house full of young ones, and when I drove up, they'd come running out to the car, and I'd get, a smudgy kiss and a hug, and then usually the news that something was broken, could I fix it, or some toy wasn't working, or some project that they had for school wasn't working out, and they had no idea that I couldn't somehow solve their problem. They were wrong a lot of times, but nonetheless, it was that kind of, oh yeah. And that sort of was where this lad was. This is Jesus. He asked for bread. I've got bread. Here. And there he goes. You know, the difference is Jesus. He saw Jesus. He heard him ask for something. He had it. He gave it. End of story. Well, not quite the end of the story. But it was the little that he had was enough. And it becomes for us the paradigm of how it is to live in faith. Is how often can we ask ourselves the question about whether we are enough, or whether we have enough, or whether there are sufficient resources before we start something, and we leave out of the equation Jesus. Maybe what we have, who we are, plus Jesus is plenty. Plenty for a miracle. So it is with us. One of the writers talking about this particular story talks about being in that same cottage, and there, as the sun is going down, the day is almost over, a young boy comes running into the house, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Mommy, Mommy, Jesus and I worked a miracle today." And you know, he'd be telling the truth. He and Jesus worked a miracle that day. He worked the miracle of giving what he had. That was his side of the issue. Jesus took it from there and fed the 5,000 people. It bothers me to think how often I have stood on the banks of a miracle thinking, I'm not enough. I can't do this. And not realizing that I'm worried about what God is going to do. That's not the question. The question is, what am I going to do? How am I going to be a part of this miracle? Jesus and I worked the miracle, the boy said. And it's true. And it may be true for us. I have no way of knowing which miracle you stand in the presence of, or to know what your gifts might be, whether they are a crude lunch or whatever. Can you ask, will my little check really bring any peace in the world? Will it really bring a missionary to the country? Will it really take off the debt for the church? Those are not the questions to ask. The questions to ask are, what have I got that God needs in order to work a miracle? And if we can answer that question in the same kind of willful action that we see in this lad, then we will be witnesses to a lot of miraculous things right here in this place and time. Will you pray with me? Gracious Lord, you have given us so many opportunities and so much opportunity to be the kind of catalyst that brings off miracles, whether it's a small miracle in someone's life or one that makes the headlines. But forgive us for our reticence and empower us to dare to believe and to act, that there be no miracles waiting for our response. We ask in Christ's name. Amen.